Our next speaker is Stephen Shearer. He will be talking to us on the topic of mobile is eating the world. Please welcome Mr. Stephen Shearer.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Fantastic. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for making the time to be with us this morning. I took a lot out of Pip's conversation and Pip's presentation just a minute ago. I've got a few themes that will echo what she said, but probably a slightly different take. And maybe that comes from my Facebook heritage. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through a few things. One is talk a bit about myself and where I come from and what I did at Facebook. Talk a little bit about the rise of mobile and how mobile has started to change the world of business, change the world of society. But then more interestingly, look at what's coming next. And when I say next, this is not next, like 10 years from now. This is next, this is tomorrow, this is next week, this is next month. In some ways, next is already here. And how that is now going to start to impact how businesses work, how universities work, how society works. And we're starting to see some of those effects already. Before I kick off, I just wanted to tell you a couple of little stories, little anecdotes. Always good to kick off with an anecdote or two. Now, yesterday, I started my day in Sydney, and I woke up and I went in and I spoke to a bunch of tax accountants and some of Australia's leading tax experts. And it was a conference a little smaller than this around the future of tax and how technology was disrupting their world. I then got in a cab and I went over and I saw the CEO of an ASX 20 company here in Australia. Big business. I'd never met him before, but I went to talk to him about how disruption was affecting his business. And he was a very B2B style business, and he had the similar questions and issues about, what do I need to do? Then I hopped on a plane, I flew down to Melbourne, and I presented to a group of 100 leaders from an ASX 10 company and spoke to them about how disruption's coming into their space. And they're particularly worried about the likes of Amazon. Everyone was worried about disruption. I've been in business a long time. I've never seen this level of worry. I've never seen this level of concern. And I see it in another story that I'll tell you. And this one is about I'll mention who it is. It's a media baron with the name of Murdoch. And a little while ago, I came to meet some of the media barons of Australia. And this is after I left Facebook. I kind of made their lives more challenging for a number of years. After I left, they reached out to me and we developed some relationships. And I asked Mr. Murdoch, if I came to you just 3 years ago, and I said, give me the list of your top 10 competitors, would Facebook, Google, Netflix have even been on the list? And his reply was, you wouldn't have even been in the top 20. And that was just 3 years ago. Today, number 1, number 2, number 3. Facebook, Google, Netflix, in some different order. So in just 3 years, somebody who runs a media empire and has gone through tons of disruption and has disrupted media themselves, was disrupted by something that they didn't see coming and didn't necessarily understand. And that doesn't mean they're not smart. It just means the pace of change, I think, has come upon us so quickly. So let me just take you through a few things. One, let me just tell you a bit about myself. I had a little intro there, but I think I always get asked, what's my background, what did I do in the past, et cetera. I started out back in the 90s, in the pre-internet days, as a strategy consultant. I then went on to head up strategy, business development, innovation for a few iconic Australian businesses across a couple of different industries. And I also worked for a company called Inchcape, which is one of the world's biggest automotive retailers and distributors, an ASX 100 company. I'm sorry, a FTSE 100 company. And then I worked across a number of startups, sort of in between normal jobs, in photonics, optoelectronics, in mobile apps. So I cut my teeth both in the kind of corporate innovation space, the big strategy space, and then in the more startup space. And that's what led me to Facebook in 2012. Where I joined when the business in Australia only had about maybe 10 people. And we probably made about $50 million a year. And we really were just a social network that hadn't figured out how to monetize the platform and the audience that we built. Over those 5 years, we built that business to over $1 billion US dollar business here in Australia. And today, Facebook in Australia has about 120 people. And so what I do today is, in addition to spending a lot of time with my family, which is one of the reasons I shifted gears and left Facebook, is I work a bit with PwC Australia as a special advisor with some of their biggest clients. I work with across the range of different industries and clients, everybody from As I mentioned yesterday, so everybody from media clients to entertainment to education to government to retail to banks, everyone's facing similar questions and problems. And what I want to do is help Australian businesses win. As was mentioned before, I really loved building one of the greatest technology companies in the world, but I want Australian businesses to be the ones to thrive and survive and thrive in that environment. I don't want them to fall by the wayside, and I think there is a risk of that in the next couple of years. So that's what I focus on now. Traditional leadership in digital leadership in traditional organizations, digital strategy, what matters, what doesn't matter, how do you make sense of the chaos? How do you transform your organization to compete today, tomorrow, into the future? And ask these sorts of questions. Who am I really competing with? What are the things that I need to worry about in terms of capabilities to build, et cetera? These are simple questions, but I think the challenge of answering them are greater than ever. So let me just ask you to do a little test here. I'll show you a photo. Spot the millennials. And I'll give you a hint, I'm not a millennial. In fact, I qualify as a baby boomer. I just slipped in. I was born on the second last day of the baby boom. So I just slipped into the baby boom. So there's three millennials in the picture. They're the three folks in the middle, and the one in the very center is Mark Zuckerberg. And at this time, I think Zuck was about 26, 27 a few years ago, and Cheryl's over on the left. And this is probably not, it's representative of America today, and I think Australia today. I just read the other day that millennials in the US, and I'm sure that similar data would be true for Australia, are now the biggest single age cohort in the US. They've surpassed baby boomers. There's more millennials than there are baby boomers. And that the number one age cohort in the US, so it's how old somebody is, if you're 21 or 22 or 23, is actually 26. There's more 26-year-olds in the US now than any other age. It's probably similar data here in the US. So this sort of captures that. Mark at this time was about 26, 27. He's got a couple millennials next to him, and then he's got sort of our older folks fanning out across him, and the particularly old guy on the far right. So Facebook's rise has been pretty dramatic, and I won't linger on all the data on this slide, but it's emblematic of what's happened over the past few years with the rise of mobile. And back in 2012, when I joined Facebook, it was a modest business. It is just listed on the NASDAQ, and its Fortune 500 ranking was number 482. Come up to 2016, and this is how the business performed. And there's a couple of numbers in there that I think are important. One is the percentage of the business at Facebook that came from mobile. So mobile was actually not even a core part of Facebook's business back in 2012. By today, Facebook's now generating almost 90% of all revenue, and in fact, 90% of all user activity is on mobile. It's not on desktop anymore. And that just happened in a few short years. And the number of users, of course, has continued to increase. And this has increased off the back of the rise of mobile. In the short time Facebook has existed, since its founding back in 2003, 2004, it has faced two huge existential pivots. The first one I just mentioned. It was the pivot to mobile. The iPhone came out in 2007. Prior to that, Facebook was purely a desktop environment, and it was more like a bulletin board. If you remember the old Facebook and you look at it today, you think, how did this business ever get off the ground? It was really just a bulletin board. Mark noticed after the iPhone came out, after a couple of years, he noticed there was a shift in behavior over to mobile. And he predicted himself that the shift in computing is now going to shift over to mobile in a huge way. And if we don't take Facebook and pivot the business and the business model over to mobile, we will die. We will disappear. He literally told the whole company that in an all hands on a Friday. By Monday, he had taken whole teams, essentially hundreds, if not thousands of people in the business, and moved them from working on desktop to working on mobile. And we retrained those teams, particularly developers, to work in iOS and work on Android from working on desktop environments. And that was a pivot we had to make in order to make that transition to get over to where people were moving. The second pivot we had to make that almost, I think, would have killed us if we hadn't, was over to video. In my first 2 years at Facebook, the word video never crossed my lips. We never ever talked. We didn't have a video product. There was no video on our platform. If you remember a few years ago, Facebook was mostly photos and text. Now if you go through Facebook or Instagram, how much video do you see? it's become essentially a video platform. This happened just in the last 2 years. And that movement to video is going to continue. You're seeing now the war that's developing between the likes of Amazon and YouTube and Facebook and Google for eyeballs on mobile video. So those two pivots have happened in the time that Facebook's grown from just a few million users, or a few 100 million users when I joined, to the business that it is today. There's 2 billion people on Facebook today on the face of the earth. YouTube is the second largest in terms of monthly active users. And then you've got Instagram and WhatsApp, which are both Facebook businesses as well. And this just gives you a sense of the scale of some of these businesses. These are the most scaled businesses in the history of the world in terms of the number of users they serve, given the size of their business, in terms of the number of employees that they have. And we shouldn't forget what's going on in China with WeChat on the right. China has formidable competitors. We could have a whole hour just on what's going on in China. So this ecosystem is essentially the mobile ecosystem, and it's really, the battle has largely been won by Facebook in the mobile world. But Facebook believes, and Google, Amazon, and others believe, that the battle on mobile is not actually where the future battle is going to be. So Facebook's won this war, but now the war is moving to another place. And you start to see this by these sorts of S-curves that you can draw. So here you see the number of PCs in the world, you see the number of people in the world, and then you see the rise of iOS and Android smartphones, which is the high-end smartphones that all of us in the room would have. There's about 2.5 billion of those phones in the world today. Back in 2007, there were 0, none. That's the fastest adoption of technology in the history of the world. And there's about another 2.5 billion other cell phones in the world, which are the kind of we call them feature phones at Facebook. Over the next few years, all those feature phones will go away. They'll all become high-end smartphones. It's just a matter of time. But smartphones will then become saturated in the world today. And that's a good thing for all of us, but we all have to realize that this revolution is just kind of starting, and it's hard to predict where it's going to go. It's good to look back at history. Back in the 18th century, there was something called the French Revolution. In 1976, Richard Nixon went to China, and he met with Zhou Enlai, who was the premier of China at the time. And at some point, Nixon asked him, what do you think, he was asking about revolutions and revolutionaries. He said, what do you think the significance is of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai's famous reply was, it's too early to say. So we are in a course of a revolution where the outcomes are a little too early to say, but we can kind of look at the vectors and where things are going. So I have that as a bit of a disclaimer on some of the things I'm going to say for the rest of this morning. So we've got these S-curves, these development curves from creation to deployment. We went through it with PCs. PCs hit saturation. Businesses figured out how to build businesses and deliver value over PC environments. And that world has kind of now passed us by. It's kind of there. We've gone through this process now with mobile. We're getting to the point of what we call deployment, where businesses are figuring out, how do I monetize the world of mobile? How do I create businesses that sit on top of mobile? What Facebook and others realize is now we're moving into a new world where there's going to be artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, and that world is going to create its own S-curve where mobile is going to become largely irrelevant and the new battle is going to be fought on new computing platforms. So here's a number for you, 5. The 5 biggest companies in the world today are all tech companies. And this has been propelled largely by the rise of mobile. 5 years ago, only one of those companies was a tech company. That was Microsoft. So it's still part of the big 5. We forget actually how big Microsoft is, but it's still one of the biggest 5. But the new 4 ones are Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, who have come largely from nowhere. Literally, Facebook was nowhere back in 2003, 2004. These are all now $500 billion, $300, $400, $500 billion companies. One of them will be the first $1 trillion business in the next few years. So that's largely being propelled by the growth in mobile around the world. And the scale of these businesses is important to realize. So forget about the market cap and the number of employees for a minute, but just think about how much they invest in technology. In 2009, the 5 biggest companies in the world invested $5 billion in CapEx, just a few years ago. It's a lot of money, but guess what? In 2016, they put $40 billion into CapEx. Facebook alone will put $25 billion into artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality over the next 3 years. Add to that what the other 4 big companies will do. Add to that what Samsung will do. It's not on the list. You can go down the list. There are literally hundreds of billions of dollars are going to go into these new computing platforms over the next few years. The difference between a few years ago was it was startups doing this stuff. Now it's the world's biggest, most cashed up, most funded companies that the world has ever seen are pouring money into these areas. And so you've got the scale of 5 billion mobile users today. You've got unprecedented scale of the GAFA, which are Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. You toss Microsoft in there as well. And then you've got new ways of competing that develop off the back of that other businesses take advantage of. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. One is called Wish.com. Anybody in here have Wish on their phones? Okay, you got a bunch. I recently, a few months ago, I was speaking to the board of a big retailer in Australia. And they were asking me, what should we do about Amazon and how should we think about the future? And I said, look, I think you're missing a lot of stuff. And so I gave them, I asked them a few questions. I said to them, have you ever heard of a company called ContextLogic? And they'd never heard of it. I said, well, ContextLogic actually is the parent company of something called Wish.com. Have you ever heard of Wish.com? Nobody around the room had heard of it. So I said, okay. Wish.com has raised about $1 billion in venture capital. It's in Silicon Valley. It's a bunch of ex-Facebook, eBay, Google people that have gotten together. They brought the Amazon smarts around artificial intelligence to, if you like this, if you bought this, you'll like that. They've brought supply chain expertise into China so they can literally get thousands of Chinese suppliers bidding into their system. And then they poured a ton of money into Facebook because this is essentially it's a mobile-only business in order to do customer acquisition. In fact, ContextLogic over the past 2 years spent more money on Facebook ads than any other company in the world, bigger than Procter & Gamble or McDonald's or any other big advertiser. They leapt the field. Here in Australia, they have also started to pour money in, and they have acquired tens of millions of users around the world pushing their apps onto people's phones. They believe that there's room in the world for 3 trillion-dollar marketplaces: Amazon, Alibaba, and themselves. And they are a mobile pure play marketplace. Rumor is that they turned down a $10 billion acquisition offer from eBay and a $10 or $11 billion acquisition offer from Alibaba because they still think there's more business and more value to be built. That board I was speaking to had never heard of ContextLogic and never heard of Wish.com. And maybe that was partly because Wish.com hasn't focused a lot on Australia. They actually haven't poured a lot of money into growing this market. They focus more on developing markets, the US, Europe. But in Q4 of last year, while I was still at Facebook, they started to turn on their spending here. And in 1 quarter, I related it to the board. I said, one of your businesses, which you really rely on to drive profitability, you drove about 10,000 app installs onto people's phones using Facebook in that quarter. So I know the data. And they were like, yeah, that sounds about right. They might have 1 million apps on people's phones in Australia. And mobile is very important for how people shop. I said, in that same quarter, Wish.com, while you drove 10,000, they drove 300,000 app installs in Australia onto Australians' phones. And so I asked them a final question. I said, how do you think Amazon's going to do their acquisition in Australia? And at first they were like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I said, they're going to spend money on Facebook and they're going to drive apps onto people's phones. That's the best and cheapest way to do it. So they were all scribbling down ContextLogic and Wish.com. And what it said to me was, the things have moved so quickly that they're not keeping up. And they hadn't heard of a company that's now coming right after their customers, directly after their customers, had already gotten 300,000 of them last quarter. Let me give you another example. Who in this room knows who Kayla is? And I would suggest that it's almost all women who put up their hands, and it's not men. And the reason is Kayla is a mobile-first business. She is the world's biggest fitness personality on Facebook, on Instagram. She has about 10 million users, followers globally. She is from Adelaide. She's about 25 years old, and she is worth, according to BRW Magazine, about $150 million. She started to build her business. She's 25. She's never run another business before. She started on Instagram before we even had ads on Instagram. We started ads on Instagram 2 years ago. As soon as we turned on ads, she started to pour money in. She was my biggest single advertiser in Australia. Out of 100,000 advertisers I had in this country, she spent more money with me over the last 2 years than anyone else. In fact, she spent almost $25 million with Facebook over the past years, building her $150 million empire. I have a little story on this one. I was sitting with Kerry Stokes, who owns Channel 7, and Kerry had reached out to me to have a chat. And he was saying, who are your biggest advertisers? What do you? I said, well, I related the story about, he had heard of Kayla. He said, I know who she is. We had her on Sunrise. She was a guest. And she was like, she paid you $25 million? We didn't charge her a penny. And his CEO was in the room too. He glanced at the CEO. His CEO was like, oh, yeah, sorry. But these are things that are happening in the background that even in this case, another media bear didn't see. So what's coming? Let me just say, I think there's 6 things. I try to condense my talks into things that are not too high up in the clouds and not too down into the detail. So here's the way I think you should think about the world in terms of what's coming. There's 6 themes here. And I'm going to go through these in turn, so I won't linger on this slide. But let's go to the first one. There's a communications revolution coming. It's a virtual revolution. And I mentioned it before about the amount of money. If you think mobile is big, the money that's now going into VR, AR, AI, Internet of Things. I won't go into detail about what all these technologies are. You've heard different things. But essentially, they're going to change how people communicate with each other, and indeed how machines communicate with each other. And they are going to be embedded into the fabric of our lives. So that in one example, people will no longer type to computers. You will talk to computers. This has already started with Siri. It's getting better and better. And the reason it's gotten better and better is essentially this. The question, is there a dog in this picture? Up until a few years ago, computers had a lot of trouble answering that question. In fact, the error rate was super high. It was about 28% in 2012. Those error rates come down to about 7% on image recognition. On speech recognition, come down to about 4%. If you remember early speech recognition from a few years ago, you get frustrated. You say something, and it was always a joke. You say something serious, she doesn't understand it. That is now getting down to single digits. And when it gets to single digits, it makes speech something that you will naturally use all the time. You won't say, I tried it a couple times and it didn't work. So that's happening. And what it's really driving is this reduction in friction. And you think about, it's not just about people who can talk, but it's moving the friction of communication that's been caused by things like distance. An example here, Uber Eats. A colleague at PwC, he related to me a story. He went home one night, he was a little late, and he said to his kids, let's get some food delivered. So they got some food delivered and it came by Uber Eats. The next night he goes home and he says, kids, let's get some more food. Let's get some Thai tonight. We had pizza last night. And he pulls out his phone and starts to order it. And his 15-year-old says, don't use Uber Eats. They took 22 minutes. His 15-year-old's like, use something else and just use Deliveroo or whatever. There's another app, right? Friction. Uber's worth $70 billion or something, but that 15-year-old just 22 minutes, I'm out. So friction is this sort of industrial strength insect repellent now for consumers. And it is definitely a millennial thing, but it is flowing through our ecosystem now. We have to be on top of friction. Second thing to think about, how to think about this. Everything is available to everyone. This is, I think, something we need to really understand. Platforms. Amazon, Google, Facebook, all these things are platforms. There's other platforms in the world that have been built and that are accessible to everyone. So you can access all kinds of things that a few years ago were only controlled by few, by the biggest companies, by the ones with the most capital. So you think about data, information, entertainment, talent, skills, news. You can now get those things from lots of different sources as consumers, but so can businesses. So the cost of starting a business is lower than ever, and the access to talent or data or insight is easier than ever because of these platforms. You see it's coming from the cloud. You see it from businesses in Australia like Freelancer. And you even see unintended consequences. And I think this is what's going to happen, not just in politics, it's going to happen in business. You're going to have unintended or unpredictable consequences. Essentially, it was this sort of everything available to everyone that in a sense led to the downfall of Hillary. When you think about how Donald Trump used social media and used the tools of social media to drive his campaign, he was very clever, and the people in his group, I shouldn't say Trump was clever, I think the people with him were clever. And you're seeing it with the Russian allegations today and what's happening. Those are unintended consequences of everything available to everyone. That a Russian, nefarious folks in Russia can somehow try to influence a US election using what's available to everyone, which is Facebook. And even that has caught Facebook by surprise. So what does it mean to be a consumer, a business, a citizen, a government? That is going to start to be redefined in the next few years because of this democratization of information and of everything. Another trend, things go to people. A few years ago, thousands of years ago, I don't remember these days, I'm not that old, we lived like this. We were nomads. If you were hungry, you walked to food. If you needed shelter, you walked to a cave. If you were cold, you walked to someplace that was warmer. Over the centuries, that has changed. So in that world, people would go to things, but as agriculture, transportation, other technologies have come in, it has meant that less and less do people go to things, more things go to people. So when I get hungry today, I don't walk to a farm or to a forest to kill something, I just go to a supermarket. Or I call Uber Eats. Or maybe not Uber Eats, because I take 22 minutes. Now, what's happening now is the emergence of digital technologies that I believe are going to accelerate this trend towards things going to people. And I would summarize those by saying drone delivery, autonomous vehicles, and virtual reality are going to start to change the equation of why people move around. And it's going to happen very fast. If we're sitting here in 10 years' time, we are going to have whole industries disrupted by this change about how people move around and why they move around. Airports. I talked to a group that are designing new hospitals, and they're thinking about it. If you think about anything that involves transportation, anything that involves logistics, anything that involves customers getting off their sofa and walking into your store, they're all going to be affected by this. Why would I go to Bunnings on a Saturday afternoon and fight through traffic when I could just put on a pair of glasses or slip in my contact lenses and I could be standing in a home improvement superstore with a real human being right next to me? The technology is there today. It will be in your hands within a couple of years. Marketing. Brands. Everyone assumes brands are as old as the hills, but I believe the future is going to belong to fast brands. Many of the brands on this slide, they've been around for a long time, but we've got to remember that brands didn't exist at one time. Every business was local back in the old days, before the creation of mass media. And that mass media was largely television. Newspapers changed a few things, radio did, but TV really changed a lot. And a few years ago, this is how it was. I think almost everyone in the room can remember these days. There were a few TV stations, everybody watched the same shows, everybody got the same commercials. You could show one message, the same message to everybody. Now what's happened? People aren't watching free-to-air TV, they're watching Netflix. What's the big difference with Netflix? There's no ads. What's the big difference with Amazon Prime, which will be coming soon? No ads. YouTube Red, no ads. So these are non-ad supported media. Add to that this challenge, which is you've got tons of time being spent on social media, gaming, or shopping on Amazon, which is also taking up a ton of time. God isn't inventing any more time. There's a limited amount of hours in the day, and that time now is not being spent on, increasingly is not being spent on traditional media channels. It's being spent in this fractured world where you can't just show somebody a 30-second TV commercial and hope that they watch it. And worse yet, you can't show the same message to everybody and think your job is done. If you go to a Kayla, the reason in this room when I said who's at a Kayla, no man put up their hand, is Kayla doesn't talk to men on Facebook and Instagram. She only talks to women, and only women that she wants to talk to. Often she targets women who have been pregnant, have just had a child, because they know they want to get back into shape. So that's who she talks to. She could never do that on TV. It was impossible. She could never build her business there. She can build it across the world using Facebook and Instagram. So what happens to mass brands when all this starts to happen, right? People don't watch these traditional channels. They don't go to your brand's website. They form different relationships. They use Google and Amazon. This is a whole new world for brands that they're just starting to figure out. I've talked to so many CPG companies, retail brands, and they are befuddled by the changes in behavior that they're seeing in their consumers. And so I think the future belongs to what I call fast brands. These are data first, digitally savvy. They probably don't use mass channels at all, and you're seeing hundreds of these brands pop up in countries like the US and the UK. And they focus on service excellence and innovation as their core, and they really get rid of a lot of those bad habits, getting rid of friction, getting rid of mass media bad habits, and they think about consumers and how they present themselves to consumers in a completely different way. And it's a different message to different audiences. It's not the same message to everybody. And you take that one step further and think about the world of Amazon Alexa. And when you go and you talk to a computer and you ask it to do something for you, and you say to Alexa, hey, we're out of Coke, what is Alexa going to say? Is she going to say, do you want me to reorder Coke for you? Maybe. Or is she going to say, hey, you know, Coke costs this much. There's another cola with exactly the same ingredients, exactly the same taste, and it costs half as much. It's called Amazon Cola. Would you like me to order that instead? And she could do either one. Why would Alexa, who's driven by artificial intelligence, why would she care about 100 years of Coke advertising about how Coke makes you feel? She couldn't care less. So that is a very daunting world for brands that are going to have to get their heads around. And then two final things. I think there's an end of splendid isolation for so many businesses and I think countries as well. We used to sit in a world where this was a question a few years ago that was asked of Jeffrey Bukes, who was the CEO of Time Warner. And he said, you know, is Netflix a threat? Am I worried about the Albanian army invading? He was dismissive. And this is what happened in the meantime. His business has increased in value to about an $80 billion, billion dollars US. Netflix is now worth more than his business. And he's no longer the CEO. So maybe that's part of the reason. That's how quickly that world changed. And here's another question that was asked just last year. You know, would you buy financial services from any of these companies? This was asked in the US. And what was the survey result? 55% of Americans surveyed said, yes, no problem. I get a home loan from these guys. I get a credit card. Why not? For a bank, this sends a shudder through their body. Well, we've spent 100 years branding money, and now these guys come along, and over half of consumers say, yeah, no problem. I would buy my financial services from these guys. And in China, they already are. This is already happening with Alibaba and Tencent. And then you see this. I toss this in as I think it's important to recognize. Telstra cut its dividend recently. But if I went to any of Australia's biggest companies and said, what's one of your biggest problems? They would say to me, I don't have enough money to invest in technology. Why? Because of the tech giants and others that are investing a ton of technology. Then I say, well, wait a minute. You hand back billions of dollars every year to shareholders as dividends. Why do you do that when the tech giants, all those big five companies, you know how much they hand back to shareholders in dividends every year? Nothing. Zero. They reinvested all back into technology. So we have to kind of rethink, and Telstra started to take those bold moves to think about how do I allocate my capital. And then I'll just do the final point, which is only learning companies will survive. Pip touched on this earlier, but I think this is absolutely true. Facebook is, one of the things that Facebook's DNA is the fact that it's a learning company, and we talked about it all the time when we built and ran the business. And you see this in one simple thing that's come from my experience. I was speaking to one of these big retailers in Australia, and we were talking about voice and Alexa and how that might impact the world of retail, an example I just gave with Coke. And I said, how many people do you have working on AI, voice assistants today in your business? And the answer was 0. And this is a business with 30% market share. It's a big, dominant player here. If you pop over across the pond to the US, how many does Amazon have working on? 2,000 people, and they've been working on this for about 15 years. So for a learning business, the starting gun, and for this particular business, sounded about 10 years ago on artificial intelligence and voice assistants, but they didn't hear it because they weren't thinking and learning about what the future held. And now the race is already lost. I have no idea how they're going to catch up with Amazon. And so if you think mobile is big, and it is impacting every aspect of our lives and businesses today, the next wave of innovation that's going to be built off the top, on the top of mobile, that's going to come from the same businesses that brought you mobile, those 5 companies and the thousands that sit around them, is going to be even bigger. And it will disrupt every single business, every single organization in this room. It's an exciting time. I can't wait to see what happens, and I want Australian businesses to be the ones that win. Thanks very much for your time.
We've got time for about 10 minutes worth of questions with Stephen. Stephen, you've got a unique set of insights having led Australia and New Zealand for Facebook. I was really struck by your story of Mark making that decision. It sounded like Mark Zuckerberg making that decision to take teams of people off desktop and onto mobile. What's going on in the mind of a leader like that has the courage and the vision to make, significant resource allocation decisions like that? When, the example you gave of an Australian business that's so far behind, what's the difference between the mindsets of these two different leaders? What are they doing differently?
Well, first I should say I've been in Australia for 25 years. There's amazingly well-run businesses here, and that example is a really well-run business. It's, in fact, globally, it would be in the top, decile of its peers. It's an amazing business. But the example of that is just how quickly things are changing. It's even the best businesses find it hard to keep up. So just coming back to your question about what's in Mark's mind when he makes those changes. I'll tell you a little something about Mark. When you're talking to Mark, you can tell he's not listening to anything you're saying. He's just looking straight through you. He's being polite. He's learned how to be polite. He used to not be so good at it, but he's gotten better. And so Mark's, that's something you're always struck by, is he's always looking, he's always thinking ahead. And I've related this to some CEOs here. Mark's relationship with Sheryl Sandberg is an amazing relationship, and it's one that the books have and will be written on. He was smart enough to hire somebody who knows how to run a business in a way that Mark knows that he could figure out, but he doesn't really, it's not his passion. His passion is not the numbers and the ratios, and his passion is always thinking, one step, 10 steps ahead. And so whenever Mark talks to us as a business, and he even does it externally, he is the one that talks about the strategy and the vision, and then he lets the CFO or Sheryl talk about the numbers. And I think he does that purposely. I think he could talk about the numbers fine, but he does it to separate himself from the short-term stuff that's really important to our shareholders. It's got to be looked after, but I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to talk about the bigger, longer-term stuff. So I think that's one way that he brings a lot of credibility to. He doesn't shift from, I'm going to talk about numbers, then I'm going to talk about the future. He only talks about the future. And so whenever Mark opens his mouth, everybody listens. And Mark spends all his time thinking about the future. That's basically his job description.
That's interesting, because we had a question earlier about, well, what do small businesses do? They can't necessarily, bet the whole farm on AI or mobile. Has Facebook had some big failures as well? Some big predictions that didn't work out right? Or?
Absolutely. People may remember there was a Facebook phone at one time, which was a big idea. Hopefully you don't remember it because it was a big flop. But out of that, we learned a lot about mobile applications and how they work on phones. It was a bit of an experiment that we decided to release into the wild. There's been other things that Facebook have launched that we've quietly kind of muffled. We've done a lot of other apps, actually not just Facebook, but there's other apps we've released. That some of which we've kind of strangled. In part that's because we learned things from those apps and then we killed them later. And we incorporated the features of them into other things. I think luckily we haven't had a big, when I say we, I'm talking about Facebook. Facebook hasn't had a big existential misstep. But Mark, as many Silicon Valley leaders are, is super concerned that we will have a misstep. He's not complacent at all. And in fact, he's a very, whenever we seem a little complacent, Mark's always up to say, hey, we don't know anything yet. And if I'll give you one example is Snapchat. Snapchat's, you saw the numbers up there. Snapchat's a lot smaller than Facebook, but Snapchat is a very innovative business. They've done a lot of clever stuff. They've been really innovative with how they use the camera, and how they think about ephemeral messaging, things that disappear, which Facebook just didn't really look at for a long time. And Facebook has borrowed a lot of Snapchat's smart ideas to make sure that Facebook doesn't lose the mojo of innovation.
And that's true. I mean, my teenage children much prefer Snapchat to Facebook, which is an interesting one to watch. Do we have some questions from the floor? One down the back. Can we get a microphone right down the back and another microphone up the front, please? Oh, we got one. Excellent. Thank you.
You ready?
Yeah.
Hi, Michael Boyle from QUT. My role is about the question of government and what role it may or may not have in this evolution as we go forward. So government tends towards protectionism of old businesses, and it also, I guess, particularly Australian government recently has shown that it's probably out of touch with the general populace in terms of opinion. So does government have a role in either encouraging a new economy or or does it still play a role in stifling that in some way?
Wow. So, thank you for the question, Michael. I won't necessarily agree or disagree with the Australian government being out of touch. I think all governments lose touch to an extent. I mean, it's a tough question. I saw it in the media industry, and to be honest with you, I think the media reforms here should have happened, 5 or 10 years ago. I think the regulatory structure was not the right structure for the new digital world that we live in. And you can probably say that then you can go across a lot of industries and say, how are they, just from a regulatory point of view, let's just take that point of view, how are they regulated today in Australia? And is that the right way to do it, however you define right, for the current state of technology that's impacting and competition that's impacting that industry? I've been talking a lot to banks lately, and arguably you could say that the 4 pillars policy, there's a policy in this country, I think to paraphrase it, that the 4 banks can't merge and they can't be acquired. That basically we're going to have 4 big banks in this country, which has served us well for a long time. But you might argue that in the future, that is just going to create 4 subscale, non-competitive, low innovation, dinosaurs or mini dinosaurs that are just simply not going to be able to compete in the future. So in fact, the 4 pillars might be inhibiting the creation of a super Australian champion bank that could sort of take on the world. Because those banks are notoriously, they haven't gone and taken on the world in a big way. They haven't been able to break out of Australia. So I don't have a simple answer for you, but I think one of the things I do is I talk to government a lot about this space and how to think about it. And government's like anyone else, it needs to learn fast. And I don't think government is learning as fast as it could today. Thank you.
Okay, our next question here at the front.
Hi, my name's Claire Burton. I'm an IT consultant.
Hi, Claire.
And non-executive director. I had a question about mobile and how you think it's going to evolve and change as all of those millennials and, to be honest, 30-somethings age and start to get arthritic thumbs and, reading glasses and so on, because I perceive that part of the reason for mobile is that, younger people are so much more comfortable with small media.
Yeah. I mean, I think voice and virtual reality are good news for those of us with failing eyesight, and I'm one of them, and big thumbs. We kind of take for granted that the interface we've become accustomed to the past 10 years, which is a touch screen, is kind of the default way that we're going to interact with computers. We've gone away. The mouse is still there. But that sort of interface now is being superseded by touch. But touch is just another interface. It's another technology, and it will go away eventually. It may not disappear completely, but it will be disrupted by these emerging technologies. Hand gestures, voice, virtual reality will come to replace touch in the next few years. So I think that is probably going to answer your question about how all people interact with technology. More specifically to millennials, I think another way to think about millennials is they're just young people, right? And the young people are always, I think in every society, tend to be the most innovative, the most restless, the most in a hurry. That's nothing new. I'm sure if you go back to caveman days, they would complain about the teenagers around the campfire. But I think we all have to realize that their habits and ways of doing things are not going to change radically as they get older. They're not going to. So I take friction as an example. I don't think, if you ask a 70-year-old today, hey, are you comfortable with filling in this form to get a home loan? Are you comfortable that it takes 2 days to have a product delivered that you ordered? A lot of them say, yeah, no problem. I'm used to that. If you ask a 15-year-old those same 2 questions, they say, forget it. Uber Eats took 22 minutes. As they get older, they're not going to get used to, now it's okay to fill in a form to get a home loan. They'll say, no, I want it to be as smooth and easy and seamless as Snapchat or Facebook or Instagram or all the other apps that I've used. So that's the big bubble that all businesses are going to be challenged by. Great question. Thank you.
We have time for one very, very quick question and answer down the back. Do we have a microphone? Great, let's go for it.
Hello, my name is Alex Pendoshte. I'm from GovHack, which is a big data competition, a national competition around open data, government data. I really liked when you mentioned your passion about Australian businesses. And my question is, in terms of infrastructure and education and the way it's going in Australia compared with other regions of the world that you've seen, would they provide enough support for Australian businesses in the future?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you
Yeah,
phrase it?
infrastructure and education, the way it's going in Australia,
Yeah.
would they provide enough support for Australian
Right.
businesses?
Right. So infrastructure and education, are they purpose fit for the
The way
future?
they're growing, yeah, the way,
for the
the way
digital
we're heading.
future.
Yeah.
Big question, and I would say, if I had to summarize, I'd say the answer is yes and no. So there's clearly challenges, and you've asked two questions, infrastructure and education, which are two big areas. I think infrastructure-wise, we do have a lot of challenges here around some of the fundamental digital infrastructure that this country has and how it compares to other countries, particularly if you go up to developing markets like Asia, where they've leapfrogged us in technology. You go to Korea, the broadband speeds are lightning fast, and as a result, Korea has a huge, thriving mobile video ecosystem that is probably the envy of the entire world. In Australia, we're not as strong on those broadband speeds, and therefore businesses can't build those mobile video-based businesses that they can in a country like Korea. In terms of education, the whole world is being challenged right now about how do you strike the balance between technical education, hey, everybody should learn how to be a coder, versus fundamental education, which is people should learn how to think, be adaptive, and learn. And I think that mix is different in every country. I've seen indicators that says Australia does pretty good. I've seen indicators that says Australia does pretty bad. I genuinely believe that Australia probably sits somewhere in the middle of the pack. There's probably a number of things we can do to solve that on a national and local basis. But I would also suggest, how we think about immigration is another factor that should really be considered. There is talent all over the world that is looking for the best place to apply that talent, and I believe that our current immigration system doesn't address that enough to bring that talent here to Australia. So that's a super complex topic, but that's my quick answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the question. We will be touching on the future of learning and education after lunch, if you can stick around for the session with Professor Susie Derbyshire. Please join me in thanking Stephen Shearer for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.